Hi, good day. So, for this topic, it's all about humanism and the Renaissance area. Yes, we will talk about more of the, not the turtles, but more of the timeline and the understanding where it's coming from. And most of the questions there were asking, is Splinter part of the Renaissance era? We'll probably we'll see. We'll try to discover if he is part of the Renaissance era. So let's start with the Renaissance era. So the Renaissance, gonna spell here. Yep. So the Renaissance is generally dated from approximately around 1450 to 1600. Although many historians would date it as the much beginning or beginning much earlier rather. Renaissance means the rebirth, and during this period, tendency was to go back to the more open-minded method of inquiry that characterized by the Greek philosophy. It was the time when Europe gradually switched from being God-centered to being human-centered. So if God exists, then He exists in nature. Therefore, the study of nature was to study God. Also, God had given humans the ability to create works of art. So as you can see here, they have their Venus de Milo and Mona Lisa. So, famous works during the Renaissance period. So the term humanism, it applies to no, going back to rebirth. So the rebirth, after all, God in His infinite wisdom must have given humans this attributes for a reason. Attention was diverted from the heavens, where the Pythagoreans, Platonists, and including early Christians had focused it, to humans living in the world. So basically, from the heavens, they focus more of the grounded ones, which is the humans here on Earth. Nowhere is the spirit of times better illustrated than the work of the Renaissance humanists. So there's gonna be a little bit confusion here because it has a different term between a different term of definition, rather a different definition of humanism. The term humanism here, it applies to the Renaissance. Does not mean as to humanitarianism. It does not refer to a deep concern about the welfare of humans, nor it does refer to humanness or treating one's fellow humans with respect, sensitivity, and dignity. As it applies to the Renaissance, humanism denotes as an intense interest in human beings, as if we were discovering ourselves for the first time. Interest was focused on a wide range of human activities and how we think, how we behave, and feel, or what we are capable of. Now, these and related questions are reflected in the four major themes characterized by the Renaissance humanism. So what are those four? So what are those four themes characterized by the humanism? One would be individualism. Now, according to Ho and Chu, the value of the individual, autonomy, individual responsibility, individual achievement, and self-reliance were important components of individualism. Sorry for that. Individualism. There was a great concern with human potential and achievement. The belief in the power of individual to make a positive difference in the world created a spirit of optimism. Another would be personal religion. Although Renaissance humanists were devout Christians, they wanted religion to be more personal and less formal and ritualistic. They argued for a religion that could be personally experienced personally experienced rather than one that the church hierarchy imposes people. Many of the good things can be seen in religion, like guidance, inspiration, community with people who care, and objects and moments of beauty. Many bad things can also be seen in this era. Beliefs that seem impossible, mistreatment of non-believers, services that can be time-consuming and boring. Of course, this is very traditional in the sense of practice. The pros and cons can be specific, though, like in liking or disliking a particular chapel, preacher, or group of certain attitudes or practice. Now, to get the good and avoid the bad, this may take a cafeteria style of approach, accepting some beliefs but not others, joining at times with a group, or having personal types of religious practice. Many use this personal approach as members of churches, temples. Others do it mainly on their own. So it varies on the individual on how one perceives religion. So they call it personal religion. It is hard to avoid some involvement with religion. Even the most ardent seculars and atheists attend weddings and funeral services, have occasional spiritual feelings, and at times, when pondering questions, may look deep to consider the source of it all. Next, interest in the past. The Renaissance humanists became very enamored with the past. The works of early Greek and Roman poets, philosophers, and politicians were of special interest. Take note, it includes politicians. Renaissance scholars wanted to read what the ancients had really said instead of someone's interpretation. As we all know, back in the Greek days, everything was written in poem, and it depends on you how you interpret those things. Now, they sought to assign correct authorship to old manuscripts because the authorship of several manuscripts have been assigned incorrectly, and they attempt to expose forgeries. Now, this time they're more of keen towards this period. These activities introduced Renaissance scholars with a wide range of viewpoints from the past. Of many of these views found considerable support among humanists. For example, there were much previously unknown of Plato's philosophy discovered, resulting in a wave of interest of Plato. So basically, they were culling out things, or they were doing the digging up, and realized that there were a lot of works which was basically either Plato or Aristotle or something like that. So they now did the digging and sort of compartmentalized it properly. Now, in 1462, Marsilio Ficinio founded a Platonic academy in Florence. He sought to do Plato's philosophy what the scholastics had done for Aristotle. So basically, Aristotle already has this kind of foundation, and then Plato some of his works were lost in the wind. So basically now, Marsilio sort of wanted to have that kind of same foundation as Aristotle has. So among the humanists, almost every early Greek and Roman philosophy had its adherents, because Plato was especially influential, and even two extremely old Eastern religions were discovered simulating great interest in the occult. So now we're since there's this called personal religion, it sort of like segregates now to followers of some philosophers, and then create in some foundation in it. Next, This also is a time where anti-Aristotelianism was sort of profound. Many of the humanists believed that the church has gone too far in embracing Aristotle's philosophy. Um, it had reached to a point where Aristotle's philosophy was more authoritative than the Bible. Try to imagine that, more authoritative than the Bible. So can you imagine? Bible itself is like a manuscript or manuscript for the religion of Christians, and it goes beyond, or even go beyond such. The feeling there was is more authoritative compared to the Bible. Passages from Aristotle commonly settled theological disputes. To the humanist, this was ridiculous because Aristotle had been only human. And like any human he's capable of errors. To regret of the humanist, Aristotle's philosophy, along with Christian theology, had been used to create a set of rules, regulations, and beliefs that one had to accept in order to be Christian. So you have to go through this, and even to a point of accepting it, to become a fully fledged Christian. Accepting the church dogma became more important than one's personal relationship with God. Therefore, the humanists attacked the church dogma harshly. Although they were many interests of Renaissance humanists, space permits only a few to review, or a few of them. So basically, what had happened is, at the current day of this new or modern thinking, at that period of Renaissance, they were questioning now the church and the beliefs and what's attached to it, that makes it probably at that period a lot of realizations were made based on the church. Probably there were mostly now abuses from the church as it's growing through its followers. So at this period, they tend to ask and question things. So let's have a brief travel of players of humanism. So this is in the end, probably we can explain why Mario and Luigi is there. So perhaps we'll go deeper, and then probably you can conclude or sort of get the link or connection with. So let's start with Francesco Petrarch. Francesco Petrarch was commonly anglicized as Petrarch, an Italian scholar and poet during the early Italian Renaissance, and one of those early humanists. Okay, he is considered as the father of humanism. Petrarch's rediscovery of Cicero's letters is often credited with initiating the 14th century Italian Renaissance and the founding of Renaissance humanism. In the 16th century, Pietro Bembo created the model for the modern Italian language based on Petrarch's work, as well as those of Giovanni Boccaccio and the lesser extent of Dante Dante Alighieri. Petrarch would later be endorsed as the model for Italian style of Accademia della Crusca. So basically, it's very hard to pronounce these things. It's Italian. So you have Giovanni Boccaccio and Dante Alighieri, and Petrarch itself. Petrarch. Francesco Petrarch. Okay. So next, Giovanni Pico. This is the best philosopher and best known as a philosopher of the Renaissance, and his Oratio on Dignity of Man, better known as better known than any other philosophical text in the 15th century. So this philosopher goes in the mid. Pico was also remarkably original, indeed idiosyncratic. The deliberately esocentric and aggressively um, character through of his thought may help explain why Renaissance philosophy had so small place or a small place until recently. The cano- canonical in the canonical history, sorry for that, in the canonical history of discipline accepted. Sorry for that, for the noise. It distracts me. Anyway, the canonical history of the discipline as accepted by Anglophone philosophers. He insisted that all philosophies have common elements that reflect human, rational, and individuality. So, as you can see, it has still a link with the church. It has a strong link with the church, despite it's a free think, or it's a modern way of thinking. It still has a great. The church still has a great influence in each of these early philosophers. Next was Desiderius Erasmus. Now, this Dutch humanist was one of the greatest scholars in the Northern Renaissance. The first editor of the New Testament, and is also an important figure in patristics and classical literature. Now, he exposed exorcism and alchemy as nonsense. Okay, he begged people to take lessons from the simple life of Christ instead of the circumstance of the organized church. He was disturbed. Bishops were becoming rich and famous because of war. Okay, he was born in Rotterdam. He was not an ordained priest. He was opposed to fanatical beliefs of anything, that fond of pointing out mistakes in the classics, and claims that anything can be made by humans are not perfect. So anything that humans make, rather, are not perfect. So this now is the first person, or the first philosopher who went against the structure of how they treat church, or look at church, or the philosophy of church. Probably there are a lot of factors. Perhaps because he was not an ordained priest. Probably that's one of the factors there, and probably he saw the corruption within the system. Okay, he wanted to take lessons in the life of Christ instead of the organized church, or the beliefs, or the very, not just mundane, but rather strict culture of the church. And there was also a realization there that he was disturbed by bishops becoming rich and famous due to wars. So this is probably one of the few philosophers that took a step further in this modern day thinking away from church. Next would be Martin Luther. He was a German theologian, professor, pastor, and a church reformer. Luther began the Protestant Reformation with the publication of his 95 Theses on October 31, 1517. In this publication, he attacked the church sale of indulgence. Now, there's a former priest again, an Augustinian priest, who was excommunicated during 1520 and grew into a religious movement called Protestantism. My bad. Protestantism. So basically, Protestants. So basically, that's where they started. Created a new religion that denied the authority of the Pope. Perhaps during this time, they were awoken by such dark scandals of the church, perhaps. So he founded his own, despite of being a former Augustinian priest. He founded his own and began the movement of the Protestants. Next, it's Michel de Montaigne. How do we say that? So, this is pronounced as Michel de Montaigne. Michel de Montaigne. The question is not who will hit the ring, but who will make the best runs at it. So he did not glorify human rationality, nor did he believe humans to be superior to animals. Human rationality was the cause of wars. Now, he is talking about the holy wars. Okay? As a humanist, he conceived of philosophy as morals on the education of children. Education is identified with the philosophy, this being understood as the formation of judgment, manners, and everyday life. For philosophy, which was as the molder of judgment, is significant to the very ordinary, varied, and undulating process of life. In fact, under the guise of Montaigne's achieved the humanist revolution of philosophy. Now, the rationality here is he was arguing of human rationality was the cause of war. Now, as a description of human beings were above animals because they can rationalize things. However, due to that also, it has caused a lot of problems. Despite animals don't have that capabilities of rationalizing or that ability to rationalize things, they go by instinct, yet still they seem to be living in harmony. So that's where he got the statement where human rationality was the cause of wars. And an example of that is the Holy Wars, Jerusalem Wars against the Turks. Next, there were like challenges to church and authority. The Renaissance is a breakdown, and the breakdown of the church authority went hand in hand. So during the time of progression of Renaissance, it was sort of the philosophers sort of like separate themselves and more towards the science of it. Church dogma consisted of fixed truths. An example of this were the 7 heavenly bodies in the solar system, and the Earth is smacked right in the middle of the solar system. And humans are created in God's image, and the truths were slowly changed or challenged. Okay? Once it started these challenges, the questioning to the church desperately try to fix those challenges of the truth. Okay? They tend to discourage questioning even to a point of challenging the church. Perhaps Dan Brown, authors were probably in these a lot of times. When you look at it, if you look at it, backtrack to the last 2 philosophers that we mentioned, they were even former priests. If you think about it, an Augustinian priest and a priest who was not ordained to question such practices that the church has. Now, there are feats. These are the feats that sort of challenge it or the church. One example would be the exploration of Marco Polo. 2 would be invention of the printing press by Johann Gutenberg. 3 would be the discovery of America by Columbus. Was it really a discovery, or was it just a takeover using the religious perspective of it? Or was it really an invasion? Because as we all know, America already had a culture and already had a civilization from within. But Westerners claim that they discovered it and sort of refined America with it. Next, Luther challenged to Catholicism. That's why he made the Protestants, or the movement of Protestants, was there. And lastly, which is all Filipinos would know, the circumnavigation of the globe by Magellan, which he ended up, welcome to the Philippines, and here you shall lay and rest. So, as a Filipino, realizations come across like, oh, that was really a very interesting part that Magellan also brought to the Renaissance period, and it contributed such. Although, yeah, he ended up here in the Philippines, where he lay and rest. Now, there were other philosophers there that was a non-Aristotle, or wasn't really following Aristotle. But let's see the timeline here. You have the Ptolemaic system by Ptolemy. Believes that the heavenly bodies include the Earth in a spherical shape, and then the Sun and Moon and other planets orbit around the Earth. Earth was the center of the universe. That was the one of the first few discoveries, or first few. Now remember, Ptolemy was not really Greek. What I know was Ptolemy was also Egyptian, which had one of the first few civilizations that the world has, or had an advanced. They had things advanced, especially in astronomy. It was accorded well with the testimony of the senses. Like, for instance, the Earth does not appear to be fixed in the center of the universe. It allowed astronomical predictions as accurate as could be expected without the aid of measuring instruments. So, this time, astronomy was also famous at this era of Renaissance. Later, it was congenial to Christian theology because it gave humans a central place in the universe, and thus in agreement with the biblical account of creation. So, creation of life, the universe, the stars, the moon, the earth, and where it's placed. Remember, they don't have that much of a technology where you can just look at your apps or check out the maps or have satellites, but just looking at and observing the stars, they come up with this theory that they sort of established. Next was Nicolaus Copernicus. Nicolaus Copernicus. From 1473 to 1543, he was a mathematician and an astronomer who proposed that the sun was stationary and in the center of the universe, and the earth revolved around it, distributed by the failure of Ptolemy's geocentric model of the universe to follow Aristotle's requirement for the uniform of circular motion in all celestial bodies, and determined to eliminate Ptolemy's theories and an imaginary point which around the body seemed to follow the requirement. So Copernicus decided that he could achieve this goal through a heliocentric model. He thereby crafted a concept of universe in which distances the planets of the sun bore directly relationship to the size of their orbits. At the time, Copernicus' heliocentric idea was very controversial. Not many accepted it. Nevertheless, it was the start of the change in the way the world was viewed, as Copernicus came to be seen as the initiator of the scientific revolution. Try to imagine these things. These guys were from the past, and yet they seem to predict or even create a map of the solar system and the universe. So during this time, Ptolemy said, okay, Earth was the center of the universe. And Nicholas Copernicus said, no, the sun was the center of the universe. So they sort of have that kind of banter from there. Who is really the center of the universe? Yet the widespread of planetary theories advanced by Ptolemy and most other astronomers were, although they were consistent with the numerical data, seemed to likewise represent no small difficulty. For these theories were not adequate unless they also conceived a certain equalizing circles which made the planet appear to move at all times with uniform velocity, neither of its different sphere nor about its own epicycle center. Therefore, having become aware of these defects, I often consider whether there could be perhaps be found, this is on the perspective of Nicholas Copernicus, I often consider whether there could be perhaps be found more than reasonable arrangement of circles from which every apparent irregularity would be derived while everything in itself would be moved uniformly is required by the rule of perfect motion. So he was skeptical about why is it so very uniform in a spherical motion, when he was thinking, why is it so easy perhaps, or so precise? So he wondered and thought about it, that the planets have different shapes or sizes and it revolves differently. And like I said, it's going back and forth to which one is the center of the universe. Is it Earth or is it Sun? So during this Renaissance period, they go back and forth on who's the center of the solar system. Next, you have Giordano Bruno. Now looking at this one, this is how Giordano Bruno perceives. This was first introduced in the Philippines as a brand of shirt. No, just kidding. First introduced as a very known brand in the Philippines. Nope, that's not the Giordano we know. He's known for his cosmological theories, which conceptually extended to the then novel Copernican model. He proposed that stars were distant suns surrounded by their own planets, and raised the possibility that these planets might foster life of its own. A philosophical position known as cosmic pluralism, he also insisted that the universe is infinite and could have no center. He also tried for he was also tried for 8 counts of heresy. Now, this is where the fascinating part comes. Now, try to imagine that these people have less of an instrument compared nowadays in technology, that we can go to space and take photographs and even send satellites as far as to a different solar system. But these guys sort of like had this thought as the universe is not, is vast and wide, and our solar system is not just, there's tons of other solar systems inside that universe, and that stars have their own, has distance, has their own planets, which is amazing. Like, is amazing knowing that they don't, or probably that's the question there. Maybe they have this kind of instrument by the aliens, perhaps, as a controversial, you know, standpoint of conversation, or just to start off conversation. Aliens, perhaps, an ancient, non-Earth, alien technology. But look, these guys can predict, even without those kinds of materials that they use, can predict that, or see, or foresee the universe. That's how amazing. And the more philosophers try to look at the stars, they tend to sort of drift away from uh, the religious aspect of it. They're now talking about the aliens, and could be touching the origins of human beings. Now, it sways away from the teachings of the Christians, or the church, or the churches. Now, because of this, he was tried for 8 counts of heresy. So you see this very rigid thing, that despite of this movement of free thinking, yet the church stops it from there. I wonder why. What do you think? Why the church stops the free thinker from these things? Maybe you have the answer. So let's move. Next, we move to Johannes Kepler. He first studied with the Lutheran ministry, but could not accept the rigidity of Lutheran doctrine, and switched to study math and astronomy. So, this is he is one of the key figures in the 17th century of scientific revolution, best known as for his laws of planetary motion and his books of Astronomia Nova, Harmonices Mundi, Epitome of Astronomia Copernicae. So basically, he wrote books, or laws of books. So Johannes Kepler, even the Lutheran was already a breakaway from the Christian system. He still finds the Lutheran ministry very rigid. Okay, now I wonder, in the Philippines, people studied philo as free thinkers. They study philo to be free, and to be a free thinker, and talk about the possibilities, different possibilities, than math, who seem to be absolute in numbers. But in these times, strange yet similar phenomenon, as from Filipinos, like, oh, I don't like math, I'd like to have philosophy, to have this kind of free thinking with no boundaries in it. And yet people in the philosophy in these eras would rather study math and astronomy, because they find it, because probably at these times philosophy was closely knitted to the Christian, or the religious aspect. So next was Galileo di Vincenzo. Let's move my face here. Yep, it's basically Galileo Galilei. So let's call him Mr. Galileo, that one. Now, Galileo Galilei. Let's stick there. Yes, looking through the lens gives a better picture of how the universe and the world works. So, he was an Italian astronomer, physicist, and an engineer, sometimes described as polymath from Pisa. Galileo has been called the father of observational astronomy, the father of modern physics, the father of scientific method, the father of modern science. So basically, he fathered a lot of things, but all of these things are basically science. So it's sort of it's leaning towards the scientific community now. So he fathered a lot of things basically. So yes, looking through the lens, since one of the creations there was observing through the telescope lens to see a better picture of the universe, and yet the world works, yet other refuses to look at the looking glass. Okay, for others, okay, that's why they don't want to indulge Mr. Galileo Galilei. For others, that if God meant man to use such contrivance in acquiring knowledge, he would have endowed men with telescopic eyes. So they have that quote by Kuhn, 1957. So for them, they still have this kind of denial of things, or whatever, since it's mostly Galileo's perspective, or looking at the lens of him through the scientific lens. It was steering away from the religious aspect of it, or proves some of the religious aspects wrong, or makes you question of the religious aspect. Then some of the people who sort of would not indulge Galileo Galilei's discoveries. He made a sharp distinction of subjective and objective reality. So now this contribution is very crucial to the course. Objective reality exists only independently on anyone's perception of it. Okay, these attributes are later in history called primary qualities, which is absolute, objective, capable of precise mathematical descriptions. The secondary qualities, which constitute subjective realities, are purely psychological experiences and have no counterparts in the physical world. So now he sort of distinguish what the subjective and objective reality. For objective reality, for instance, this phone, you can hold it, and if you describe it physically, it's there. It's the primary description, and the reality of it is primary. While the contents of it would be subjective and would depend on what lens or whose lens are you looking through. Next is Sir Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton is another scientist who discovered basically gravity. Now, he made principles, or the principles of Newtonian science, the powerful and highly influential principles of Newtonian science, can be summarized as follows. 1. Although God is the creator of the world, he does not actively intervene in the events of the world, or deism. It is therefore inappropriate to invoke his will as an explanation of any particular thing or event in the material world. So now it's a very clear cut of which one is scientific and which one, because probably the explanation for everybody is, oh, God wills it, it's made by God, so don't question it. So it's just like that. So now he sort of put a line there on which one is scientific and which one is the religious aspect. Now, he wanted to separate it. So let's move to the next one. Like for instance, the material world is governed by natural laws, and there are no exceptions to these laws. So as he observed and made scientific explanation towards the world, it's what do you call that? Undeniable that the scientific direction was rather undeniable. The third one was there is no place for purpose in the natural law, and therefore Aristotle's final causes must be rejected. In other words, the natural events can never be explained by postulating properties inherent in them. Bodies fall, for example, not because of an inherent tendency to fall, but as Aristotle had assumed, but because the various forces acting them. In other words, Newtonian scientists, one must not invoke theological explanation. Okay, it's not inherent, but rather it's natural events explained by postulating properties. Okay, so now it's very clear with these properties that it goes away, putting a line on which one is scientific and which one is more of clinging towards the religious aspect. Occam's razor is to be accepted explanations must always be as simple as possible in a book of his principles. Newton gives this advice: we are to admit no more causes of natural things such as there are both true and sufficient to explain their appearances. This is the principle that led Copernicus and many of his fellow mathematicians to reject geocentric systems in favor of the heliocentric system. Because with God, the simplest is always the best. So too should it be with mathematicians and scientists. Newton's conception of the universe could not be simpler. The fifth one would be natural laws are absolute, but at any given time of understanding is imperfect. Very contradicting. It's absolute, but understanding is imperfect. Therefore, scientists often need to settle the probabilities rather than certainty. This is because of human ignorance, not because of any inflexibility of natural laws. So everything can be explained, and basically we there are some things that we have not yet to explain. So we do it by probabilities, not so certainty. As realizing right now in the science of psychology that there's no black and white in it, but rather a gray area, a probability. I realized that when you talk about in the courts, in forensic, mostly the lawyers would talk about is it a yes or a no? And as scientists, like psychologists, we talk about, yeah, there's a probability, there's a chance, there's 100%, there's a 50% of it and stuff. There's no absolute in it. So that's one of the Newton's laws. Next is the sixth one is the classification is not explanation. To note that the chasing cat seems to be in the characteristics of dog does not explain why dogs tend to chase cats. To understand why anything acts as it does, it is necessary to know the physical attributes of the object being acted on, such as mass, and the nature of forces acting on it. Again, no purpose of any type can be attributed to either of the object to the force acting on it. So now we have the laws of force in motion. There are little evidence that the 16th and 17th centuries, such as faith, was more than a dim of hope. Nevertheless, the seeds has been sown. Scientists were uncovering more and more of the secrets of nature, and more explanations were now being given out without the benefit of the clergy. So no, there are more scientific explanations without the involvement of the clergy or the church. So now we are now going outside. We're now separating what is scientific and what is the religious aspect. Next would be Francis Bacon. Bacon, in 1620 to 1994, summarized the 4 sources of error that he believed could creep into scientific investigations in his famous Idols. He was one of the leading figures in the natural philosophy in the field of scientific methodology in the period of transition from the Renaissance to the early modern era. As a lawyer, member of parliament, the Queen's Counsel, Bacon wrote questions of law, state and religion, and as well as contemporary politics. But he also published texts which he speculated on possible conceptions of society and pondered the questions of ethics. Even on his works, The Natural Philosophy, The Advancement of Learning. So now he dwell on the ethics. The idols of the cave are personal biases that arise from persons' intellectual endowment, experiences, education, and feelings. Any of these things can influence how individual perceives and interprets the world. It's very perceptive of him. Idols of the tribe are biases due to human nature. All humans have in common the abilities to imagine, to will, and to hope. These human attributes can usually distort perception. Sorry, I have to move myself here on top. For example, it is common for people to see the events as they would like them to be, rather than how they really are. Thus, to be human is to have the tendency to perceive selectively. Very beautiful. The idols of the marketplace are biases that results from being overly influenced by the meaning assigned to the words. Verbal labels and descriptions can influence one's understanding of the world and distorts one's observations in it. Bacon believed that many philosophical disputes were over the definition of words rather than over the nature of reality. So now the humans argue because of the definitions of the word, but forgetting the actual nature of reality. Idols of the theater are biases that result from blind allegiance to any viewpoint, whether to be philosophical or theological. So now they get to question now the biases, the blind allegiance of the viewpoint, whether if it's philosophical or theological. And sometimes or most of the time, the explanations of the church or religious, not just the church, the religious aspect will just would be definite and not to be questioned. So now, in this modern or free kind of thinking, they tend to question more. Yes, it's a bad time for religious or churches right now. So let's move. Let's move to René Descartes. René Descartes, in 1596 to 1650, was a creative mathematician of the first order, an important scientific thinker, and original metaphysician. During the course of his life, he was a mathematician first, and a natural scientist or natural philosopher second, and metaphysician third. Well, he talks about the philosophical truth, which is now the first rule was never to accept anything as true unless I recognize it to be evidently such. That is carefully to avoid all precipitation and prejudgment, and to include nothing in my conclusions unless it is presented itself so clearly and distinctly to my mind that there was no reason or occasion to doubt it. That was the first rule of Rene Descartes in talking about the philosophical truth. Next was to divide each of the difficulties which I encountered into as many parts as possible and might be required for an easier solution. So we break things down basically for short. Third was to think in an orderly fashion, beginning with the things that were simplest and easiest to understand, and gradually decrease by reaching towards more complex knowledge, even treating as though ordered materials were not necessarily so. So, realizing it, this was one of the first few scientific methods, as we call it then. The last was always to make enumerations so complete and review so general that one would be certain that nothing was omitted. So, like I said, scientific method. The approach there was to having created a method of things is to take it as it is. He also came up with innate ideas. Descartes' method then consisted of intuition and deduction. Intuition is the process by which an unbiased and unattentive mind arrives at a clear or very clear and distinct idea, an idea whose validity cannot be doubted. So that rational process were valid, and that knowledge is a physical word gained through senses and could be accepted because God would not deceive us. But that even sensory information had to be analyzed rationally in order to determine its validity. Probably or perhaps Freud got his influence in dream analysis, because Descartes also had a dream analysis of some sort. Now this is regarding to the thread of dreams that is likened to the brain. Now Descartes' explanation of sleep begins by noting that while organisms are awake, the cavities of the brain are filled with animal spirits. That the brain tissue engulfing the cavity expands slightly, increasing the tautness of the delicate threads and thus making them maximally responsive to sensory stimulation. Now, talking about the animal spirit, the concept of animal spirit was very popular then among the early Greeks, such as Aristotle, and was perpetuated by highly influential physician, which was Galen. Now, in connection to this, he focused attention on the brain as an important mediator of behavior, and he specified the mind-body relationship, such as with clarity, that it could be supported or refuted by others. Reactions to his notion of innate ideas were so intense that they launched new philosophical and psychological positions, which is currently we call it modern empiricism and modern sensationalism. Descartes attempted completely completely mechanistic explanation or to explain it in a very step-by-step method of the many bodily functions and much of our behavior as human beings. His mechanistic analysis of reflexive behavior can be looked at as the beginning on both stimulus and response and the behavioristic psychology. So, as a mathematician, Descartes had a very has contributed to psychology very much as very what do you call that, intricate and very great contributions, of course. Now, of course, there's always controversy. The controversy concerning Descartes' religious belief clearly reflects the transitional period in which he lived in. If one accepts the face value of what Descartes said, he undoubtedly believed the existence of God and accepted the authority of the church. Especially Descartes, around 1642 to 992. However, Descartes was caught between his loyalty to the Catholic Church and his objective search for the truth. So, it became a dilemma for him whether to be loyal to the church, meaning to refute everything and just believe in God and don't ask more, or rather search for the truth and keep on asking. So it's the dilemma was just there on Rene Descartes. So before ending anything, it was in a nutshell the rebirth of European culture in the Dark Ages. This is after the Dark Ages. It was sort of rebirth because of the Dark Ages. So from the Dark Ages, it ushered in a modern era of isms. You know, isms. We call it isms because it's Renaissance. It's the feeling of rediscovering the European former glory, the Roman and the Greek culture, through a small literacy and art which focuses on human form of Romans and Greeks, like statues perhaps of the deities and the demigods there. They're more focus of it, and also figures and paintings in it. You know, paintings of human beings inside it and all of these things. Focuses also in the architecture during these times of the Renaissance period. It includes the domes, the pillars, the giant buildings that they made. Now, scholars were called humanists and has seemingly something to do with being human and nothing to do with the religion. So they say. Really, what does Dan Brown think about that? So why does the if it's not really has nothing to do with religion, then if you noticed in the Renaissance period, this is how religion has greatly influenced philosophy before or during the Dark Ages. If you look at the Renaissance period, you get to see there's a lot of variations of Madonna and child paintings. There's a lot of variations during that period. So you can't really say that Renaissance religion has nothing to do with the Renaissance influences. Yes, it has, and it has greatly affected in it. Although the direction of the philosophers was going towards away from the religious aspects, and yet if you think about the Renaissance period, it still has the religion still has a great influence in it. Yes, it's more of you get to see now the connection of why Luigi and Mario was very important to the Renaissance period. Yes, in Hogwarts, it's called dark arts. The dark arts. I mean, nowadays it's called liberal arts. So why Italy? Why Luigi, Mario? Why in Italy? Well, Italy is primed for one thing, and it's because of money and wealth. Money and the bling. It's really why there it could support scholars, philosophers. It could afford big buildings, great paintings. Italy basically was rich. And why is it rich? You get to wonder that. Most of the small states or the neighboring areas were more of an industrial powerhouse. And Italy was in the middle of things, of the trading of not just the goods, but rather the trading of the knowledge. A lot has to do with the knowledge that came from not west, but rather east, the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire contributed a lot. The Turks, the Muslims, the Turks, and the eastern parts has contributed a lot of the western. They were looking at the Renaissance period, thinking about the glory days of the Greeks and Romans. But basically, if you look at it and carefully, you know, try to dig or use piece by piece, it was more of the knowledge that came from the Eastern philosophies. The question again, why Italy? And why is Italy rich? Well, isn't Rome inside Italy? Isn't the church inside Italy? Where the bling bling and the golden thing and the golden fleece that they have there and they have them. So probably in our discussion during our class we can dwell more, but we get to think about it. Thank you.